Hello and welcome. I'm Ben Jacobson, and this is show version 6. In this episode, we're going to be reviewing how to create a Juniper lab. You can review one of our other episodes to go over what a virtual machine actually is, and in this episode we'll just be deploying Juniper devices as virtual machines. Why would you want to do this, you ask? Well, if you've ever studied for a certification, you have probably run into the situation of really wanting to actually get your hands on a device. Those can be really expensive, though. So, this is where being able to virtualize things really comes into play. We can create as many devices as we want and connect them however we want. We can break them in magical ways, and it would still be okay. Then we'll go ahead and just reset it and get back to work. Juniper has their own online virtual labs called VLabs that are freely available, and that's a perfectly reasonable place to go and practice with the devices. However, the topologies just aren't actually customizable at all. You can't move them around. I can't decide that I want to connect this interface to that interface instead. No, the way that they are right now, that's how they end up having to stay. This is where setting up your own virtual lab is really going to be handy. And besides, who doesn't like playing with network devices anyway? So in this episode, we're going to be covering 3 different ways to set up a virtual Juniper device. And we're going to be focusing on the Juniper vSRX image, the virtual SRX. Juniper does offer a VEX image as well as a VMX or virtual router image. We're just going to focus on the vSRX for right now. We'll be covering the VMX in another episode when we get to my lab for studying for the JNCIE. The 3 different types of platforms that we're going to use are Microsoft's Hyper-V, VMware's ESXi, VMware Workstation Player. Hyper-V is really fantastic. I love Hyper-V. It's built into Windows. However, it is only readily available in Windows 10 and 11 Pro and also in Windows Server. If you have the home version of Windows 10 or 11, it's not actually built in. There are ways to install it, but we're not going to be covering those steps here. I'm assuming you have Pro if you're using Hyper-V. If you don't have Pro or you have some other operating system like a Linux deployment, then we'll use VMware Workstation Player instead. Or if you have a spare computer, you can always install ESXi and use that as your hypervisor instead. So, let's go ahead and get started with Hyper-V. Here we are remoted into my Windows 10 computer and we already have Hyper-V Manager open. We see we have a few different VMs already deployed here, and I've got the vSRX demo from a little earlier. We're going to go ahead and delete that. And first, the very first thing that we need to do is to go and actually download the vSRX image from Juniper. We head on over to this site here. You can also just Google vSRX trial and it'll take you here as well. It's important to note that you do need to be a registered user on Juniper's website in order to download the software. It is a free account. You can simply select that you're an evaluation user when you're creating your account. It usually takes about 24 hours for them to approve your account. Once it's approved, though, you'll be able to go and download the software with no problem. So then we can move on to step 2. Select vSRX software. This takes us to our downloads page, and the download for Hyper-V is our vSRX Hyper-V image. Note that this is a VHD image. The VHD virtual hard disk file format is only used for Generation 1 VMs in Hyper-V, which we'll get to that and why it's important in just a little bit here. I've already downloaded the VHD file here, so we will just open up Hyper-V. We're going to create a new virtual machine. We'll click Next, and we'll call this vSRX demo for our demonstration vSRX. And this is where that Generation 1 versus Generation 2 comes into play. We have to select Generation 1 in order to use the VHD as opposed to VHDX format. The minimum memory required for the vSRX is 4096 megabytes, or 4 gigs. We'll disable the dynamic memory for this VM and move on. By default, it will only create a single virtual network adapter. We'll attach that to our external virtual switch currently, and after we create this VM, we'll add a new network adapter as well so that we actually have some additional network adapters. This is where we will select our VHD that we downloaded. We'll use an existing virtual hard disk and browse, go into our downloads. We've got our Junos VHD file here. And there we go, we can finish. Now we do need to edit some settings and run a quick command in order to get this to work appropriately as well. See, the software architecture of the vSRX runs some of the software as a VM within the vSRX. So we actually require nested virtualization in order for this to work. So we're going to end up running a command to expose the virtualization capabilities to the VM. And I'll show you that here in just a moment. First up, let's go into our settings for this VM. And we want to have 2 virtual processors here. We'll give it 2 cores. That is what's recommended for the minimum hardware requirements of the vSRX image. Now to expose the virtualization features to our VM, you'll want to open PowerShell as an administrator, as it is a PowerShell command that will enable this feature. The command that we'll be using is set-vm processor. We'll give the VM name flag, and the name here will be the name of our VM that we selected when we created it. So this is going to be vSRX-demo, and then we'll do the expose virtualization extensions flag and set it to the Boolean true value. So let's go ahead and copy this command and put it into PowerShell and just press enter. We're expecting to not get any response here, that it should just go to the next line. And that's it. Let's go ahead and start up our vSRX and make sure that everything's working okay. Now, while this is booting, we can mention that it usually takes some time for the computer to allocate the memory and to actually start your VM. The vSRX is a pretty fast device to boot, so we'll be opening up our console session in just a few moments here, and we'll actually watch this boot, make sure it actually boots okay, and we'll go through some of the little quirks that you'll see as you're trying to get this working as well. Now let's open up our console session. And we see that it's going through its boot process here. And there we go. So now, just like any Junos device coming out of the box, we'll log in with the root user and no password, which takes us into our BSD shell. We just have to enter the CLI command to enter operational mode. So now, if we do a show interfaces terse, we don't actually have any GE or other production interfaces showing up. So you might remember that we said we were going to add an additional network adapter to our vSRX. See, the first network adapter attached to the vSRX will map to the FXP0 interface. It's our out-of-band management interface. In order to have any GE interfaces, we need to attach more network adapters to our VM. So let's go ahead and power this off. And there we go, it's turned off now. Let's go ahead and go into our settings. And we're going to add an additional network adapter by just going to the add hardware at the top, network adapter, and add. And I'm going to connect this to our external virtual switch as well and click apply. So now let's start up our VM again. It automatically created a checkpoint. We don't want to start from that. We'll just go ahead and start anew. And there we go. Now we're booted up once more. We'll go ahead and log back in. And if we do a show interfaces terse, we still do not see any GE interfaces. It takes some time for the PFE to fully boot up on our virtual Junos device. So let's give it just a little bit here. We'll see some log messages go by as we just did now, and we'll run this command once more and see if we have any GE interfaces in just a little bit. All right, and we're back. And in reality, I waited about 1 minute, and we see here that we have our GE000 interface up at the top. This corresponds to the second network adapter that we attached. Now, if we go into our VM settings, our first network adapter, this will go from top to bottom. So our first network adapter is the FXP0 interface. The next is the GE000 interface. And if we were to add more network adapters, we would have GE001, 2, 3, etc. Now, there is a maximum of 10 interfaces that we can attach to our vSRX. You can have GE000 through 008, and also your FXP0 interface. And that's about all. In reality, you shouldn't need more than about 3 or 4, but you can always connect multiple sub-interfaces or logical units, right, in order to get more connections if you need from there. The vSRX at heart is a firewall, which are typically not highly port-dense devices. And there we go. We now have a working vSRX on our Hyper-V environment. Pretty easy, right? Didn't have to do much there, and it works right out of the box. And it's a free platform with a free image. What more could you ask for? Since you do need 2 cores and 4 gigs of memory to run a single vSRX, I wouldn't recommend trying to run a vSRX without having at least 8 gigabytes of memory available on your computer. You'll really want more like 16 or more gigabytes of RAM on your computer if you want to run more than one vSRX. Your RAM is really going to be your constraining factor there, your bottleneck. You can over-provision your CPU cores, and that's no problem. It'll just run a little slower. But your RAM, if you over-provision that, it's going to end up causing a lot of errors on your vSRX and can crash unexpectedly. Great. So now that we have deployed our vSRX on Hyper-V, let's go take a look at our next method here of using VMware Workstation Player. So I wanted to set up a fresh new Windows 10 machine. Windows 11 is also supported, but to have nothing else on here, to just show that you really don't need anything else in order to use VMware Workstation Player. And this is if perhaps you have Linux or you have a home version of Windows. I only just downloaded this image of Windows from Microsoft's website earlier, and that's why it's not activated here, but we're just using it in the lab anyway. I've already downloaded VMware Workstation Player here. We'll go ahead and run that installer. And we'll just click through this. It's like any other software installation. I have not installed the enhanced keyboard driver. You can if you would like to, and we'll leave the settings at defaults here. So moving on down, we'll click next through these screens and install VMware Workstation Player. While that's installing, the image that we need to use for VMware Workstation Player, if we go back to our downloads, is that we're here at our vSRX eval download screen, is we need to download the OVA image. You can download the IDE virtual disk or SCSI virtual disk. This has much more play if you're using this in a production environment. In the lab, doesn't matter so much. I usually use the IDE virtual disk, and we just download that OVA image there. Getting back to our VMware Workstation Player installer, it looks like it's just finishing up here. And there we go. Now I've already downloaded the IDE OVA image of Junos here. So let's open up VMware Workstation Player. And this is free for non-commercial use. If you want to get a license, great, you can, and it'll remove this product is not licensed message. However, this is free to use for non-commercial use, which a lab environment is by definition non-commercial. So we'll open a virtual machine since we have our OVA image. We'll select our OVA. And here we have to accept the license agreement for the Junos vSRX. And we'll give a name, vSRX demo. And we'll import. Now, unlike Hyper-V, where we had to do some post-import and post-setup tasks, with the VMware Workstation image, the OVA image, we actually don't have to do any of that. That all of the virtual machine settings are already set up the way that they need to be in order for us to just run it right out of the box. So our import has finished, and we can just click Play Virtual Machine. Now, this Windows 10 is a VM, and it's giving us a little warning saying running VMware Player in a virtual machine will result in degraded performance. That's fine. While it's going, let's go check out our last method of deploying the vSRX here, and that's with ESXi. So we're going to go to my ESXi server here. So once you're logged into ESXi, I'm not going to cover how to actually install and set up ESXi. If you have an ESXi server, great. And there's also a lot of freely available knowledge base articles and information on how to set up ESXi. It's a very, very flexible virtualization platform. I really recommend it if you have a spare computer around to be able to use. So the thing that we need to do here is to go to our list of virtual machines. And we will create a virtual machine. We will deploy a virtual machine from an OVF or OVA file. We're actually going to be using that same OVA file that we downloaded for VMware Workstation Player. The same exact image is what we can use on ESXi in order to deploy the vSRX there. So we'll enter a name for this. We'll call it the same thing, vSRX demo. And then we'll select our OVA image here. There we go, and click Next. We will select a hard drive to deploy it to. I recommend using a solid-state drive if you have one available. We need to accept the license agreement. Thin disk provisioning is fine, and we'll connect it to the DMZ. Now, this will create several network adapters by default, and it's going to connect them all to the same network here. If we want to change which virtual switch that they're connected to, we can go into the VM settings after we're done. Now that we click Finish, we see in the recent tasks at the bottom here that we're uploading our disk. So that's going to take just a little bit. While that's running, let's jump back over to our VMware Workstation Player. And we see that it's still booting up here. It looks like it's almost finished, but it's still moving along. So let's move back over to our ESXi since that's almost finished uploading our image. And there we go. Now, I actually had another vSRX demo virtual machine here previously. It let me create another one of the same name. The one on the bottom here is the new one. We can go and open up our console session and see that it is already booting up. By default, it will turn on our VM once it's finished deploying the OVA. So we'll give that just a few moments here to boot up. And while that's booting, let's check on our VMware Workstation player once more. And it looks like that's booted up. We log in. Go CLI. Let's do a show interfaces terse. Now, we don't have any interfaces quite yet here. We'll have to give it a little time. Again, since this is running on VMware Workstation Player, which is a Type 2 hypervisor, it takes a little longer for this to actually run. It runs a little slower. If you don't have any other method of running the vSRX, sure, this is a great option. But if you have Hyper-V or ESXi available, I really recommend using those instead. And there we go. We see that we have GE000 and 001 showing up in our interface list here now, and our other interface is connected to FXP0. Excellent. Moving back over to ESXi, looks like that's still just trying to boot here. So while that is booting on our ESXi server, I want to talk a little bit about some of our virtualization tools that are out there, like GNS3 and EVE-NG, EVE-NG. These are really excellent tools that make it quick and easy to create new virtualized network devices, connect the interfaces together, and interact with them and capture the traffic using Wireshark to really lab things together well. The only problem we'll run into is with our vSRX next generation image. The newer vSRX images, because of the Junos architecture where it needs the nested virtualization capability, we can run into some problems with that, and it's a lot more difficult to get that working in some circumstances. If you have the older image available, the vSRX Firefly image, which is on the 12.x code version of Junos, then that will usually run really easily and really well in GNS3 and EVE-NG. Though there are some features like some automation and other types of APIs that are available on the newer code versions that are not available on the older version. And so if you need the newer version, then going with Hyper-V ESXi or VMware Workstation Player is going to be a lot easier method to get this up and running quick and dirty in order to get your labbing moving. Checking back on our ESXi vSRX here, it's still going through booting. It looks like it's almost finished here though. And there we have it. So now that it's booted up, we can go and log in here as well. And if we do a show interfaces terse, we see we don't have any interfaces quite yet. So we would need to give it just a little bit of time, but I trust that that's going to come up without issue. And there we have it. There's our 3 different methods of getting a vSRX up and running so that you can lab things right away. I really appreciate you going through these steps with me, and I hope that this has been useful for you. You wouldn't imagine how often I get the question from students studying for Juniper certifications, asking how to do different labs and how to set up their own labs. And I really hope that this provides some useful information for you to be able to get this set up right away on your own computer as well. I appreciate you sticking with me. I'm Ben Jacobson, and this is Show Version 6.